Well, for our next session, we are going to have a discussion led by Dina Bailey. If you were around for our reinterpretation of the Van Simon site, Dina worked very closely with us on that, and she's worked with many other museums across the country. So she brings a lot of experience about what other organizations are doing and trying to help us sort of stay within the national framework of interpretation and of what's being discussed in other sites, and is really going to help us to give a little guidance again of why we're making these changes at the house, why we are using different vocabulary on the tours, and why we've changed this focus. And she's here to also answer any other kind of questions you have about talking about the enslaved people or any other of those aspects of the tour. So I will go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so as Betsy said, I am here to help answer questions and to work out some of the hard stuff. So I do this all the time with people all across the country, so don't think that you're asking a question that is silly or asking a question that you should already know, or there are no questions like that, right? So ask anything that you want, uncomfortable, comfortable, any type of question. You can ask my personal opinion about anything. I am not shy about giving that, so feel free to do that. I will not be offended, my feelings won't be hurt, any of those things. Just feel free to ask questions as we move forward. The focus for us today is, in terms of the Hampton-Preston tour, is really on the enslaved people, because that has been somewhat of an addition from what you all have previously talked about at Hampton-Preston. Is that fair? So you may have mentioned it before, but now we're really getting into it, as you saw from the sample tours that we did today. So the site goals, which are in your manual, and somebody was asking about a little bit earlier, show change over time at this site through the lens of intent and impact, and communicate experiences of people at the site based on race, class, and gender. So those are the two overarching themes, the two goals of the tour. So when I was listening to you all asking questions earlier, a lot of the questions had to do with architecture, had to do with the history of the house and the grounds, all of which is great, right? These are things that people will ask us. However, I want you all to remember, as your site goals, as you're doing these tours, that you are really supposed to be communicating the experiences of people at the site based on race, class, and gender, right? And so you will see in your manual that the primary content information has a lot to do with people. Some of the secondary information does as well. So as you're thinking about some of the decorative arts pieces that are going to be in the room, a lot of them will still be there from what you talked about before, but if you're talking about them in the future on the tour, they should be connected to the people, right? They should be connected to either the Hampton-Prestons, for example, or to the people, the enslaved people who were working and using those materials on a daily basis. Does that seem fair? Yeah. All right. So why is it important to talk about enslaved people at this site? So there are not very many sites in the nation that talk about urban slavery. You all will be one of the few organizations, one of the few sites that actually talks about urban slavery, which we know is different from rural plantations. So one of the things that I tried to put forward is, the staff and I have been talking about this earlier, is that you are doing something really unique and really important. And so it's really, really significant that you are talking about enslaved people at the Hampton-Preston site, not just because they were there and they were living there and they were doing a lot of work, but because you were filling a gap that a lot of other historical sites and organizations are not doing, right? And so that is very important. It's also significant to talk about slavery in and of itself. We talk a lot about telling the complete story here, right? We want to tell what was actually happening on the site. We know that there were a lot more enslaved people at the Hampton-Preston site than there were white people who were living there. So if we were going to tell the complete story, we need to give credence to all of the people who are actually living there. Down at the bottom here, and this is in your manual as well, and I wanted to quote it specifically. It says, Historic Colombia is committed to telling a comprehensive history of the site that includes all individuals who lived and worked here, whether by choice or by force, since the house was constructed in 1818. Right? So as an organization, Historic Colombia is committed to telling the stories of all of the people who lived and worked here. There are a lot of plantation sites, a lot of historic sites who are not committed to telling all of the stories. So again, not only are you all doing something that is trending, right, something that is really important, but you're making a commitment to do so. And so when you are talking to people and they're saying, why are you talking about all these enslaved people? It is because Historic Colombia is committed to telling the story of all people who lived and worked on the site. All right? And so if you are not doing that, and one of the other tour guides is doing that, that's going to cause some controversy, right? That's going to cause some problems when people are turning in their evaluations. Any questions about that before we move on? Just this overall, why are we doing it?
Let's see that particular page.
The part where it says Historic Colombia is committed to telling the comprehensive story is actually, I think it's like the last page. It would be as you all are wrapping up.
It's the conclusion.
Yeah, it's not the appendix, but like the last part of that. All right, so some people have said, will continue to say, why are we bringing up this ugly history? Right? Why are we bringing up this ugly history? So I have some questions that go with that. What is ugly history? What can we learn from it? Why is it important to bring up? What responsibility do we have? Is this a zero-sum game? Right? So in terms of ugly history, can someone tell me, when you have a visitor who says that, or a friend or a family member says, what is ugly history to them? What are they actually trying to say to you? Talking about slavery.
They're talking about something they'd rather not hear about or keep under the rug.
Something they don't want to hear about, something they'd rather sweep under the rug.
I think it's the idea also that people don't like to look back and think of white supremacy, and don't want to think about that.
All of the things that people don't want to think about, right? A lot of people don't want to think about it. But what can we learn from this quote-unquote ugly history? It's part of our history. We need to move forward from it.
After you learn the roots of white supremacy, or part of the roots, obviously not only in the United States.
Yeah, how not to repeat it, some of the roots of white supremacy.
What Paul Harvey says, the rest of the story.
The rest of the story, so we talked about the complete story. Is it actually ugly history? Right, let's talk about that for a second. You're saying no.
History is history. And the job of the historian is to reveal always those things that can be considered rewards, those things that can be considered. And the thing is that as human beings, the human experience, to really understand and put yourself in someone else's shoes, it's important. It's important to be able to see the total picture as much as we possibly can. It gives integrity, and without that, we're losing. We all lose.
Without that, we all lose. I like that.
Actually, I think what most of us have learned over time is incomplete history. So when we talk about the history of the South, especially through the Civil War, and really on way past Civil War, generally what most people learn, and what I've learned growing up here, you're really learning the history of white folks, very little about black folks, and what makes that, in retrospect, extremely unusual is the period we're talking about here. Almost 2/3 of the population in South Carolina is African American. So when we talk about history, we're talking about 1/3. So I don't know ugly history, but it's certainly incomplete, and it's just a part of history that people are not accustomed to learning about.
Talking about incomplete history, I think sometimes you almost need a blur, but what was the attitude towards slavery in other countries about that same time? And I see some stuff that has shocked me. There was a lot of slavery going on in North Africa. I don't know if you know about the Barbary pirates, but Jefferson sent his troops to Tripoli to release thousands of white Christian slaves, and they were treated just absolutely horrible. And that's just a little something like that. Slavery wasn't just here; it was everywhere.
It did look a little different though, right? So that's one of the things that we talk about, is how it looks different in all of these different places. But a world context, so that is important. What about, going back to this ugly part, right? The strength, the perseverance, the persistence, even when we do talk about people who have been enslaved, we're often not talking about that, right? How strong they were, how dignified they were under all of this oppression and hardship. So when someone talks to me and says, why aren't we talking about that ugly history? I'm like, I don't want to talk about ugly history. I want to talk about beautiful history, right? I want to talk about the strength of people. I want to talk about how they try to keep their families together and how important those familial relationships were, all right? So that is there as well. Is this a zero-sum game? If I talk a little bit less about the Hampton-Prestons, is that doing anyone any harm?
No, it's a little bit.
A little bit, why?
If it's just a little bit less, fine, but if it's a lot less, yes, it isn't giving a true picture of the site.
So
Got to be both.
Sometimes what happens, right? For example, we'll use this site in particular. Sometimes you're way over here, only talking about the Hampton-Prestons and the white family, right? And then people are like, oh, let's talk about everybody else. And so then we slide way over here, right? The reality is, as we've been talking about this, is that we need to tell the complete story, right? We need to give both credence. And so, no, it's not a zero-sum game. If I take away a little bit of what I'm telling about the Hampton-Prestons, that's not going to hurt anybody. We're actually adding in more and making it a more complicated, more interesting story. All right? Feel okay?
I want to ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
And, some of it is just experiential.
Yeah.
Having gone through the tour
Mm-hmm.
and wondering about various people's perception and our choice of linguistics.
Yeah.
And then, if you will, the expectation that our guests carry with them.
Mm-hmm.
And how we work with that in a positive way. And I really liked Becky's explanation of our term enslaved and the choice of that word and how you move into that.
Yeah.
And yet, I noticed one of the evaluation questions is, how comfortable are you? And I thought, well, in terms of heart of heart, I found myself really kind of struggling with that a little bit. Not so much from a personal reference, but quite frankly for the African Americans that were on our tour, I kept wondering, and how are you experiencing this? And then for others, and this question of, of guest expectation.
Yeah.
And I know we're not Disneyland here, but.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes when we are thinking about guest expectations, we think about the people who are the most vocal, right? So the people who are saying, why are you talking about all this stuff? It's not like the way it was before. But when we pay, and we should pay attention to what they're saying, but when we pay so much attention to what they're saying, sometimes we forget the other 9 people who are in the group who have been waiting forever for someone to be talking about this, right? So I have an example of a plantation that I went to in Georgia. And for those of you who know me from before, so relevant to this conversation, my mom is white, my dad is black, so I'm biracial. I went on this plantation tour in Georgia with my mom, and we went through the house, and they're talking about all these things, and they're talking about the servants, and no mention of enslavement at all. And then the woman says, and now you can go out and look at the property. So we do. And we're about to leave, and then we said, oh, let's go in the barn and just really quick take a look at what's in there. And that is where they put all of the things about slavery was in the barn, right? And the woman hadn't even said anything about it. This is where you will find information. And my mom was really upset. And she said, why didn't they say anything? Why are they talking about this? And I said, Mom, they don't really talk about this down south, right? And she was upset about it. And then she said, but even seeing that you are a black person, shouldn't she have just at least mentioned? No, because it's that ugly history, right? But my mom, who is a white person, who if she was not with me, would have no idea, right? She had been waiting for someone to talk about slavery the entire 90 minutes of the tour. She expected that because I was on the tour, they would have at least said something, even if they didn't normally say it, they would have said something. So I think that as you're thinking about perceptions and expectations of people coming in, we don't know, right? There are a lot of people that we might make assumptions of, and then it's like, no, they've been waiting for this for decades, right? On the other hand, if there are people who don't want to hear these things, you can appreciate that, but these are things that everybody needs to know, right? And so in terms of that expectation, I'm coming to this southern nostalgic mansion. That's nice. I appreciate you coming. But I'm also going to tell you all of this other stuff as well, right? And I'm not going to back down on that because Historic Colombia's commitment is to tell the stories of all of the people at the site. Yes.
Just something to bring in, it kind of goes back to ugly history, but sort of related to what you were saying as well. I wish I could remember where I heard this. I want to say it was on NPR. And it might have even been on one of Walter Edgar's, Friday things where he had various historians talking about various topics. But it was about the Antietam South, and so they were talking about slavery. And so whoever his guest was said something along the lines that typically slave owners would not refer to their enslaved African Americans as slaves, okay? So they would talk about them as servants, or they would even use the term the people, okay? But not as slaves. And it was a distancing mechanism, okay? Because, okay, they were thinking of them as property, but at the same time, especially more tender-hearted people, they realized they were people, okay? And to refer to them as slave, it was ugly, it was brutal. And if you could think of these folks as being not human, it made it more comfortable. It was a distancing mechanism, So even back with them, the people who could actually, by thinking of them as less than human, thinking of them as just property, it was even among some of them, I think, difficult for them, So, and it's still difficult to deal with. And I think that's the ugly history part, and why some people, guys shy away from it because this is hard to take, It was then, it still is.
Right, exactly, which is why we're having a conversation right now.
Right.
There is a lot of discussion about distancing, right? Some used one phrase in order to distance, some did something else in order to distance themselves. So there is a lot of that. I would hesitate to say, slave owners didn't use slaves, right? There were some people who did. There were some people who used the N-word. There were some people who used Negro. There are a lot of things that were going on and complex about that to make it better, quote unquote better, or to make it okay for how they felt about it. And we're going to get into some of our vocabulary next, right? So you've probably also heard, or are weary of hearing, you're just being politically correct. How many people have heard that in the past year, right? You're just being politically correct. So here's the answer, right? As scholarship has changed the way we understand American history, particularly slavery, our language for how we talk about it should also change. The labels and terms that have been handed down no longer reflect the best evidence and arguments. So it's not just about being politically correct. It's actually that we are being more accurate, right? We understand things differently now based on a whole lot of research that we've done, right? So it's not just because we don't want to have a problem with somebody and we're being politically correct. Scholarship has changed, and so we are changing with it. Okay? So here are some of the things to talk about. The American Civil War. Let's just start it off with that, right? It is the American Civil War. It is not the war between the states, the war of Northern Aggression, war of rebellion, the Great Rebellion, war for Southern independence, war of secession. Right? Not any of those things. The American Civil War. All of the others are, quote unquote, tainted, right? They're tainted with a lot of different things from the past. The American Civil War is the most neutral in terms of the discussion. Slaves versus enslaved people. This comes directly from your manual as well. You will hear me use the term enslaved person or people on the tour today. Historic Colombia uses this term because it gives a greater identity to who these people were. They were not just slaves or property, but were human beings in the condition of slavery. They still had families, skills, intellects, and desires, and this term provides a more accurate description of who they are. Right? It's a more accurate description, but it is also about humanity. So have people heard the phrase people first language? Yes. Right? So people dealing with homelessness, people dealing with disabilities, right? So you're putting the people first. So enslaved people gives a little bit more humanity than slaves. Make sense? Good. Okay, brought versus forced relocation. This is another one that is in your packet. So a lot of times we also want to distance ourselves a little bit in terms of what was happening to enslaved people. So they were brought with us. We decided that they should come. They didn't have any choice in the matter, right? It was a forced relocation. When they were leaving the plantation and they were coming to the city, they had no choice in that. It was a forced relocation. Okay? So that is the quote from the manual. In 1823, the Hampton family purchased this property to fulfill a desire of owning a residence in the capital city. The immediate impact of this purchase resulted in the forced relocation of dozens of enslaved individuals to this property to work at this site. Right? Some of it is about being accurate, being realistic about what was being done. Slave owner versus master versus something else. Few sites are using the word master anymore. Okay? Few sites are using that. A number of sites are still using slave owner or just owner. Sometimes they're saying owner of the property, right, or owner of the site. There are some who are making a conscious choice to start using the word enslaver. Right? So let's not use master. Using owner is still pretty accepted. Enslaver is pretty cutting edge.
So we're to use enslaver, is what you're saying.
That would be up to the staff. I don't know that they've actually discussed it yet.
Okay.
Okay, the family versus the Hampton-Prestons. So this happens a lot during the tour as well. It's something that I think we'll need to practice. Often when we have said the family in the past, we were just referring to the Hampton-Prestons. However, there were a lot of families on the site, whether they were allowed to legally marry or not, right? There were a lot of families, a lot of different family types who were here. So it doesn't seem really accurate or fair to keep referring to the Hampton-Prestons as the family when there were a lot of families. So we're going to try to use Hampton-Preston or the people's names, as often as possible. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the things that people will probably say to you on the site.
Well, and I know all of you have heard this from acquaintances. The Civil War was not about slavery. It was about states' rights. And how I respond to that is, you're absolutely right. It was about a state's right to own other human beings.
Which is amazing, and I actually have a whole slide about it. So we'll pause on that one. All right, you guys already know the things that people are going to say, right? All right, so they were only capable of, right? So this is that mythology. Those enslaved people, we were helping them out because they weren't capable of doing anything else. We know that that is not true. So, here from your manual, some enslaved workers had specialized skills and served the family as musicians, craftsmen, and equestrians, particularly jockeys. Though you could argue that all enslaved people had significant skills. All right. So the question: could Bucky have served a multi-course meal without dropping anything? Could she? Okay. Could John have picked cotton as those in the fields were expected to? Probably not. So even when we're talking about those people who were working in the fields, right, they had significant skills. And then there are quote unquote specialized skills like musicians, craftsmen, jockeys. Chestnut also mentioned that the family owned an enslaved cook who was trained in Charleston, right? So part of this is about how they being married, for example, being perceived in the community. Yeah, sure. She sent an enslaved cook to learn how to make things and to be trained in Charleston. Was that really because it's like, I don't know this person's name, right? But Mary, I love you so much and I want to give you professional development. Go ahead and train. Right? It's not really for that person. It's for the benefit of the Hampton-Prestons. That being said, again, we know from the tour that they were making a lot of things, they had a lot of recipes that were very complicated, that were using food stock that was not necessarily natural to South Carolina in particular, and that the enslaved people were not getting this type of food themselves, right? So to have someone who was trained in Charleston is a big deal. Skilled enslaved laborers. This is another point from your manual. Skilled enslaved laborers, brick masons, carpenters, joiners, and blacksmiths would have constructed this addition. There's somewhere in North Carolina that specifically talks about that, right? That there were these enslaved people who were doing a whole number of things in terms of construction that was really cutting edge at the time in terms of mathematics, architecture, engineering. So we need to give that credit to these people.
In the tour this morning, I didn't hear, it may have been mentioned, any mention of the hiring out practice, which was much more common in urban slavery than it was because of geography, really. This would be a good place to bring that up because they were still so skilled that they could be hired out to other, because many of the people who tour our sites, I don't think are familiar with the hiring out process.
Yeah, that would be really good. We didn't talk about it in the tour specifically, but that is a good point. And also to your point, there aren't a lot of historic sites that talk about hiring out. If they are talking about enslavement, it's really right here. That was one of the big things that we talked about in Cincinnati, because while Ohio prohibited enslavement, they actually could rent out people. They could hire people from across the river, right? All of that complexity. All right, it wasn't so bad. How many people have heard that? Couldn't have been so bad. So the engagement question for your manual here is, what incentive did enslaved workers have to finish their daily tasks? Of course, there was the physical threat or actual happening of punishment, right, if they didn't. What else? What else would be an incentive?
Didn't they have quotas like picking cotton and stuff like that to meet and maybe punishment too?
So punishment if they didn't, threat of violence could sometimes be enough. What other threats or punishments might you have? Outside of being whipped yourself, what else might you have?
Their families.
Families, what about them?
The children, perhaps, they could sell the children, give the children away, but what if they might do for families, to take them away from
They could sell them.
They could sell that person, they could threaten to sell family members.
Isolation,
Isolation,
being given extremely unpleasant tasks.
unpleasant tasks, isolation, not getting food, their food ration, right? There are a lot of reasons that enslaved workers would have continued working. Does that mean that they were working to the fullest of their ability at all times?
Nobody.
Probably not.
No. I mean, part of that could have been, I'm sick, right? But part of that could have been, I am rebelling, I'm resisting, I refuse to work this hard for something that I don't get anything out of, right? So we don't talk a lot about resistance, but that is one of the ways that people would resist, slowing down their work, as an example. And everybody across the field, as an example, would do it together. Setup statement from your manual. As we go into the dining room, let us consider the power structure of all the people in this place. Mary Canty entertained some of the most politically powerful people in the country who were served by individuals who had no freedom of choice. Right? I wanted to point that one out because I think that it's really significant. Really significant thinking about the people who are in this room together. You had people who were making choices for the entire rest of the country, right? Being served by people who had no choice at all. I think that's a really profound and powerful statement, and so I wanted to point it out in terms of this. How bad could it be? All right, and I know Betsy talked about this in her tour when I was with her. So Mary Boykin Chestnut wrote that Caroline Preston would reserve Maria her own room when traveling, and she probably had more fashionable clothing than other enslaved workers. Despite this, she did not have freedom. She could not choose when or where to travel with the family. She could have been on constant call for Mrs. Preston, would have been responsible for managing fellow enslaved workers, and had little to no time off. So that is also in your manual. That's the how bad could it be, right? She got fancy clothes. She got her own room when we were traveling. How bad could that really be? Well, one, she didn't have any freedom, right? Two, similar to my example about the cook in Charleston, it's not like Caroline was doing this out of some like really kind-hearted, I love you and I'm giving you some clothes, right? This is about image, this is about incentive, this is a power dynamic, right? And that's not to say that there isn't any complexity in terms of enslaved people and owners? There is. I'm not saying that there isn't. However, let's not sugarcoat this and lend any credence to saying, yeah, it wasn't so bad. She got all of this stuff.
Don't try, because you're talking about how the emphasis now is on the people, and I think that's great, you know, it's long overdue. And again, going back to, well, why should these people knock themselves out to do any more than they had to do when there's nothing in it for them? And I think if you can get people to see, you know, put themselves in the place of these enslaved people, you know, well, how would you have felt in their position? You know, what would you have done? Would you have done, you know, that's the aha moment, you know? Can you put yourself in their position? What would you have done? How would you have felt? You know?
Before I answer that, John, go ahead.
I don't think any of us could ever put ourselves in a enslaved person's position. We have to
But try to imagine it, you know? And
I think we can, I don't mean to finish up, I'm sorry. Because I've wrestled with this a lot.
Yeah.
And there's no way that I would ever really be able to, I can understand it from a theoretical construct, but to understand it, it's a challenge.
But I'm saying we're trying to make them try to imagine it.
I would say as much as we want, and it's natural to try and imagine yourself in that space, that can be a dangerous question if you actually ask visitors.
I wouldn't,
right?
no, but I'm just saying, try to lead them to
thinking about it.
It's a natural human thing, you know? I mean, why should you knock yourself out when, what reason do you have to do any more than you're being forced to do?
Well, that's part of the psychological power.
That's what
The
I'm
thing
saying.
is that, is there a hierarchy in slavery for the enslaved people? Is there a hierarchy? Yes, there is a hierarchy.
There is.
Am I better off, okay, if I am closer to the power, closer to the individual that can make it easier for me to see my children? There's a power element to this. And so there is that friction. It still exists. There is a friction there, especially with the enslaved people themselves. Not to say that they were all thinking the same way.
Well, I was going to say, and within their ranks, they're not all thinking the same way.
No.
Yeah.
And you can look at, when you look at, especially here in South Carolina, when you look at for example, the slave uprisings or revolts, how many times they were betrayed by an enslaved person that had some advantage. So there, you know, you play the system. And people, of course, at that time were surviving too. I mean, as anybody would. You can look at Irish history. You see the same kind of power plays that are being played there. You see it here in this country. You see it around the world. You see it in, you were talking, my God, the slavery that existed in the Slavic countries existed for 3 times the length of the
And that's where my
American
people were from.
slaves.
Okay,
So I'm saying that that's a whole, I don't want to make that
Yeah.
debate, but there is a psychological element here of manipulation.
There's a huge psychological element, and in that I want to go back to saying, I do think that it is pretty dangerous to say, let's imagine that we were enslaved people, right? You'll have people who definitely get offended if you say that. Perhaps not equally, but also dangerous, would be the fact that a lot of people, a lot of white people, imagine themselves as the slave owner when they come on your tour, because they're like, well, yeah, I wanna have that power hierarchy too. In reality, we know that the vast majority of people, right, white people, were not those who had 1,000 slaves and multiple plantations, right? So I think that it would be good to kind of stick with the primary history, the primary documents, and people can be led, right, to whatever change in themselves, change in perception they feel. But let's kind of tell the complete story, and whatever they make out of that story is what they make out of it. All right, there were good slave owners. Have we heard this one before? Yes. And then, to follow up, are we saying that the Hamptons and Prestons were bad people? Were they good slave owners? Okay, then my question is, what would make a good slave owner? What would it mean to be nice to your slaves?
Well, one thing that I read about in the biography of the Hamptons was that, and this, I'm only quoting what was in the book, and I don't know where the source came from, but there was a Dr. Gibbs in Colombia in that time era, and he was a physician, a regular physician, and I think he was the one that was quoted as saying that Wade Hampton too would have him come to look at slaves that were in need of medical attention. That surprised me in a way, because I did not know, I thought that it was mostly the mistress or whoever else was in the household that might be the one to try to minister to the, to the slaves and enslaved people and their problems, the medical problems they might have. But I thought that was interesting. Again, I don't know the source for it, but this was in a fairly recent biography about Dr. Gibbs. So to me, that would be, that doesn't mean he was good overall. I don't know anything else about him as a slave owner, other than I thought it was interesting that they mentioned that he would bring a regular physician to come and tend to people.
Yeah. So, right. So I was going to say, just like Charleston, just like the clothes, having someone come if there were a real problem in terms of medical help, is that really to the enslaved person's benefit? It might be icing on the cake, right? But it's really about this individual and how much they're worth.
Yeah.
So we can say those things, right, in terms of good, bad, better, worse, but always kind of with this line of being, what is the best for the Hampton-Preston family? And that's kind of what they're really concerned about. And that gets back to our original cycle, right? The intent versus the impact. The intent is to preserve my workforce, right? The impact is one of my enslaved people maybe gets to live a little longer, right? Intent versus impact. I try not to have conversations about value judgments. Bad people, good people. I think the people are really complicated, right? So, at the, hesitating to even say it here in South Carolina, but Lincoln, right? The great emancipator. Except that he also did a whole lot of other stuff, right? He helped promote genocide for Native Americans, right? People make good and bad decisions if we want to talk about those value statements. Bad people, were they bad people? I am not one to say whether they were good or bad people. Were they good slave owners? What does it mean to be a good slave owner? Just because I give you a little bit more food, does that make me good? I'm not so sure that it does, right? And that's my own value on that. Being nice to their slaves, again, what does that actually mean? If they're still enslaved, how nice can you be to people, right? Intent versus impact.
I was just going to say, I read a WPA narrative recently that was great from the Low Country. There was a former enslaved man who was saying, yes, my owner was really nice, but I wasn't free. And you can be as nice as you want to somebody, but when you don't have any freedom of how you get to do anything in your life, that negates how nice somebody can really be to you. And I think that going back to freedom is something that can always help you in that situation too. Because like with Maria, you can give her all the things you want, but you don't give her freedom. You don't give her choice, and that really draws the line.
Yeah.
But I think there are good people and bad people, so that there are going to be some owners that are better to their slaves than others. And they may be more sensitive to their needs and be kinder to them and not treat them so much as enslaved people, but as another human being. It depends on if they were Christian,
Yeah, I mean, there can only be enslaved or not enslaved, right? So we only have those two options.
That they're still not free, but they still can be better to them. that others. Some can treat them very bad, whip them and all that sort of thing. And others may not ever think about doing that, you know.
The world is on a spectrum, right? The world is on a spectrum.
Well, that's sort of the point Jules making, everything, what we're talking about is relative to what, and so, as you said, it's a spectrum. You could make comparisons if you wanted to say, this is a good slave owner, this is a bad slave owner, and say, well, you're better than, you treat your slaves better than others, but, you know, the really sad thing, and I don't think I would emphasize this on the tour, is that actually there's there's almost no evidence. There's evidence of very few people, very few white people in South Carolina that actually opposed slavery. And if they did, well, it was dangerous actually for white people to oppose slavery. So
Yeah, well, and I think there is a spectrum, right? But no matter, you know, how good or how nice, you're never going to be good enough, and you're never going to be nice enough, right, in the equation of freedom. If you're being nice to me, you're still not being nice enough unless you have freed me, right? If you're being good to me, you're still not being good enough until I am free. So that is part of it. I want to move on to, it doesn't make good economic sense, right? So here's where it says, why would they feed their enslaved workers such small rations if they needed them to be productive? It doesn't make sense. She says to keep people under control. I'm only going to feed you a little bit so I can keep you under control.
I have read that slaves, this is from Walt Edgar's book, that they sometimes did get up to 5,000 calories a day of food. So I don't know if they got different kind of food, but I think they probably got most of the time that they would get enough that you would not going to keep starving, but certainly it's going to be very limited.
But before I answer that, let me get to you.
The dominant food source of slaves in South Carolina, back to South Carolina, was carbohydrates, fat, because that's what they would burn off from their organs, and why they were so vulnerable to disease and injury, because they didn't provide the proteins necessary to build up the structure. The dominant food source for Southern slaves were fats and carbohydrates, which fueled the motor to allow them to work. What they didn't get were the proteins and vitamins necessary to develop metabolic infrastructure to resist diseases and injury.
Right, so to that point, there is going to be, all of my examples kind of go together, right? If I could buy something from Target and it's the same thing that I might buy from Macy's, but it's cheaper, I'm going to buy the Target one, right? If I can feed my enslaved people carbohydrates and protein, and every once in a while give them some vegetables, and they're still working, why do I need to give them all these vegetables, right? So what is the least amount that I can give to people and still get them to work the way that I need them to work? And even if they're not working to the best of their ability, they're still working to the ability that I need them to work to survive.
Going back to the last slide, are they bad people? You know, how can you answer that question and then say that they're not bad people, and then follow up with a statement for why they talking, why aren't they being? I mean, that's top question, that first bullet up there. B, I'm not so sure I want to stand in front of a group of people and try to address it. This is fine in a classroom environment where we can discuss it. You know, but you're already putting the guys on the time constraints, about an hour, 15 minutes to do all of these, you know, new activity panels. And how are we possibly going to have time to get into a discussion?
No.
Like this?
She said, don't talk about it. She said she tries,
I mean, if it,
don't talk about it if you can avoid it. you know, don't talk about whether these people were good or bad. We need to figure out some kind of an innocuous, neutral statement and move on.
Frederick
Everybody's
Douglass
not
said,
gonna be willing to move on, I'm afraid.
Well,
I've already got into.
Walk into the next room.
I'm gonna come up in a little bit and talk about some strategies, right? But yes, I'm not saying, let's ask all of these questions.
No.
People are going to come up to you and say, you know, they weren't bad people or whatever. So, when that happens, I do say, I don't want to have a conversation with you about value judgments on good or bad people. Right? That is what I usually say.
But we start off saying it's an ugly history. How can we call this an ugly history?
We're not saying
We're not saying it's
Yeah, we're not
ugly
saying.
history. All of these are quotes that other people, visitors might say to you, and how you can respond.
How many people have had them say, I've never had a person ask me about slavery. Ever. Now, I've not been here as long as some people have, but never.
It might not happen before, but I can almost guarantee you it's going to happen now.
I've had that question asked about were the Hamptons good slave owners? And my feeling about what they're really asking is, did the Hamptons beat their slaves or did they not? But I have had that question asked.
I've had that question asked too.
Okay, I want to get to this one. It was just the way of business, right? So, for example, somebody might say that or ask that. When we're talking about the will of Mary Canton, when she dictated which enslaved person was given to each white family member, her reference to the enslaved person's immediate family as descriptors alludes to her awareness that she is separating family members from each other. And then also another point that's from your manual, in 1858, the Prestons chose to sell their share of Hummus House to go to on their grand tour. They sold 550 enslaved people and 12,000 acres in order to do that, right? So if you're talking about those 2 points in your manual and somebody says, it was just the way of business, right? It's not personal, it's just business. What do you all say to that?
That's the way it was done, but it doesn't mean it's right.
Well, if it were me, right, it's just business, it's not personal. I would say, go back to your primary source documents. It can't just be business, it has to be a little bit personal if she's recognizing, alluding to, if she's recognizing that she's splitting up family members, then that's personal, right? She's making a choice about that. If the Prestons are choosing to sell 550 enslaved people and 12,000 acres, they're making a choice. And they're making a choice to sell those people on that acreage in order to go on vacation, basically. Right? So going back to your primary sources from the manual, it's just business. Well, is it just business if you do recognize that these are individuals? It's personal. You just don't care as much about them as you care about other things. Right? So again, that's a value judgment. And it's not that we are judging these people, it's that they have placed that out there for judgment. They made this choice. All right, here's another one. Why would you include this quote? Somebody might ask. And the quote is on one of the panels, "You know Southern houses are meant for only white people, and we must occupy all the rooms ourselves." Let me read the quote again. "You know Southern houses are meant for only white people, and we must occupy all the rooms ourselves." Can you imagine some people getting offended by that? Can you imagine some people getting confused by that? Can you imagine some people completely agreeing with that? Yeah? All of those things are possible, right? So let's break down what it really means, okay? You know Southern houses are meant for only white people. Enslaved people would have been present in every room of the house. Without those who were enslaved, the house in the Hampton-Prestons would not have been able to function. The white people would also not have occupied the rooms by themselves, literally or figuratively. By purposely reinforcing invisibility, she was also reinforcing the power dynamics and the perception that the elite class saw themselves as superior. Right? We know Southern houses are meant for only white people, and we must occupy all of the rooms ourselves.
Do we know the context, why, what she was writing around that would make her say that?
She was writing home? I forget who she was writing. Writing home to someone? Kind of talking about the day, right?
From the north. She's writing home to relatives in the north, where she was from.
So it's about perceptions, right? And it's about reinforcing this idea that this is our space. And I'm not going to recognize that anybody else is in that space.
Well, you have to talk about the word invisibility, and that's exactly it. I mean, enslaved people who were there doing the tasks that they had to perform, you know, they were supposed to be seen and not heard. They were supposed to be invisible. And they weren't recognized as occupying the space. They were almost like ghostly figures who just kind of, you know, they were there, seen but not heard.
Right. They were supposed to be. They weren't recognized. They were seen and not heard. And yet, all of this that we're talking about, right, in order to tell a more complete history, is saying the enslaved people were actually there more than the white people on this site. There were more of them than there were white people on this site. They were actually the foundation of the site, right? So if you guys are giving that quote, which is on one of the panels, and if somebody asks you this question, you can bring up all of those things, right? Going back to this, we're telling the complete story, and even though she wanted people to be invisible, they're actually the people who were, perhaps in some ways, more important to the site. Okay, have you ever heard, you are just applying today's values to the past? Has anybody heard that? I see some nods, but I see some people having not, right? A lot of times that comes up when people are disagreeing and they're like, oh, you're just trying to put our values, our judgments on those slave owners. We don't know and we can't talk about, you know, what they really felt and what they were like, all right? And so I know that this is small text, but you can always go back to your primary sources and your knowledge of the people and events of that time. There were abolitionists during that time, right, who were arguing this. There were people who did free their enslaved individuals. There were enslaved people who did leave their plantations seeking freedom. There were churches that actually literally split over this issue, right? So it's not just that we're taking what we know today and putting it on those poor people. They were actually talking about and debating and arguing and fighting over this then, right? So that doesn't really hold a lot of credibility. Additionally, I would say, there are values and principles that are timeless, right? The golden rule would be one of those, right? There are things that human beings just try not to do. Now, at the same time, slavery's been around for a long time, right? It's still happening. But we do know that there are plenty of examples throughout world history and throughout today when, if we are not following those values and those principles, like the golden rule, then that often leads to really horrible things happening, right? So it's not today versus yesterday. There are some things that we just know. All right, Are you guys ready for the Civil War and the Lost Cause? Have you guys talked about the Lost Cause on any of your tours? All right. Getting ready for this one. Okay, so secession and the cause of the Civil War. People are still talking about it, right? So from your manual, it talks about John Preston, and I'm skipping down to the second bullet point. So after South Carolina's secession, John Preston actually traveled to Virginia to convince their delegation to secede from the Union as well. So one of the reasons that we have to talk about this at this site, John Preston wasn't just any old Southerner, right? Like, he actually went to Virginia to help convince them to secede from the Union as well, right? How are we telling a complete story if we don't talk about him, who was very influential, right? During his address to the Virginia House of Delegates, he said, African slavery cannot exist at the North. The South cannot exist without African slavery. None but an equal race can labor at the North. None but a subject race will labor at the South, right? So as Virginia is talking about seceding from the Union, they are talking about the slavery issue, right? The guy from South Carolina who owns this site is talking about the slavery issue in the context of secession. Going up to the first bullet point, the declaration of immediate causes, right? So here are our reasons for seceding. The Declaration states the primary reasoning behind South Carolina's declaring of secession from the Union, described as increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery. Primary sources, right? It says it right there when people are arguing with you. It's in your primary sources. Aside from that, right, we must also put secession in context. This isn't just all of a sudden happening, and so we're not just talking about all of these causes. The election of Abraham Lincoln had happened, right? People knew how he felt about slavery. And it's not to say that he was going to emancipate everybody from the very beginning. It's a lot more complicated than that. But people knew how Lincoln felt about it, right? The Compromise of 1850 had happened. The inclusion of the Fugitive Slave Law, bleeding Kansas, right? You guys are all probably familiar with these things. These were all about slavery, and this was all leading up to the secession and the beginning of the Civil War, right? So when people are saying, oh yeah, the cause of the Civil War, all of these different things, we have to keep it in context, and we have to use our primary sources. Questions, concerns? Got a whole lot more on lost cause. Yeah?
Just real quickly, and I don't know if you're going to get this, but one of the things you do hear people say in regard to the Civil War and slavery or anything else is, it wasn't about slavery because a majority of black people did not own slaves. And I generally challenge that one, and I don't know whether I'm correct, but if you take the majority of adults and then you throw out the wives and then you take the men, and then you wonder, well, who was actually doing the housework in any home that had a little bit of money? So I'm not sure that's correct. That majority of households didn't own it, but that is a very common statement that the majority of people didn't even own slaves, but they bought from the Confederacy.
And I use that, right? So when people say to me, the majority of white people didn't even own slaves, I'm like, sure, but let's talk about the American dream, right? All the way back then, we had the American dream. And what was the American dream all about, right? Part of it was this, to be wealthy, to be in control, to have and be able to do what you wanted. Slavery got people to that point, right? So yeah, sure, a lot of people didn't own slaves. That doesn't mean that they didn't want to. It doesn't mean that they weren't striving for that, right? So the technicality, sure, is there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't fighting for the Confederacy because of slavery as well.
And also those who control the states. definitely on slaves.
Yes.
So that,
The power people, right? The people who are sitting in the dining room over at Hampton-Preston. The people who are making the decisions. All right, how aware were enslaved people of the Civil War? That might be another question. That kind of underlying gets back to that capability thing, right? Like, those black people, they're kind of ignorant, they don't know what's going on, they can't do things. They were very well aware of what was happening and the things that were happening around the Civil War. They were also, and again, this is where that urban slavery point comes across. Out where there were isolated plantations, it was a little more difficult. But here, they were walking around, they were talking to each other, they were overhearing things, not only within their own households, but within other spaces. They knew what was happening, right? That invisibility piece. Not only were the white people in the home sometimes talking about this, and the black people were overhearing, but sometimes they would be asked, right? Think about during the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement, there were a lot of people, like I think of white housewives, right? Stereotypically being like, oh, Betsy, you don't really want integration, do you? Right? Sometimes they were asking their enslaved people, yeah, this Civil War thing, you don't really want to be free, do you? What are you going to say to that? Right? Are you going to be like, actually, yes. Yes, I do. I want to be free. Thank you.
I heard on the radio a few weeks ago a story about Union prisoners that escaped and were aided by slave organizations in getting back to their own lines or getting back to safety. And in some cases, these enslaved people had such a good channel of communication. They knew more what Sherman was going to do coming through the South than the South Carolina officials did.
Yeah.
So in some cases, they told the escaped prisoners, well, don't go to Augusta because he's not going to Augusta. And of course, the South Carolina military officials thought it was.
Yes. Yes. And that, we're not going to get into the Underground Railroad and stuff, that's a whole different story. But that is something that more contemporary research says about the Underground Railroad as well. We always hear about these, especially white Underground Railroad conductors, right? These white people who are pushing people through their homes. And yet the reality is, from some of the contemporary research, that it was really black people who were helping each other all the way past the Ohio River, right? So a lot more, these people are helping each other. Black people are helping each other, whether they are enslaved or free. There's those lines of communication were there well before the Civil War and continued on well after the Civil War as well. All right, uncertainty after the war. It was unclear, right? Think about all of the uncertainty for everyone on the Hampton-Preston site. What would be happening? Again, we go back to John Preston, who went to Virginia, right? Like all of these people who had a lot of power, a lot of money, a lot of name recognition. What's going to happen to them? At the same time, what's going to happen to the, where is it? I think 76 people who were enslaved at the site at the time, right? A lot of them were trying to find families. A lot of them didn't know what the laws were going to include. That gets into the whole Reconstruction era, followed by Jim Crow, which you guys probably talk about as well, right? So what is happening? The result of all of this uncertainty in terms of the Mary Boynton Chestnut part of the family is that she is attempting, as are other Southern elites, to refocus the story, to change the narrative, all right? To say that the cause of the war is reframed to a battle for states' rights rather than slavery, to talk about the fact that it was a noble cause. And that's where we get the lost cause. All right, the lost cause. A post-war effort to distort historical record. This was a conscious effort to distort historical record. insisting that the Confederacy had not seceded in defense of slavery, but in defense of states' rights. Lost cause advocates painted slavery as beneficial to both whites and blacks, arguing the Confederacy's leaders and soldiers were men of virtue who had merely endeavored to civilize and teach Christian values to an inferior people. All right? So again, this is part of why it's so important for you all to be thinking about what you're saying and how you're saying it on the tour, because I'm pretty sure, right, I hope, that you guys don't want to be supporting lost cause mythology. Right? And so when you're standing up and saying, do I need to say something about what this visitor just said? You guys are standing up in the face of this conscious change of history. All right, common lost cause myths. The South struggle in the Civil War was heroic and just. Okay, we're not talking about individual people, we're talking about the cause being historic, heroic, and just. Right? Slavery was not the major cause of the Civil War. Something else that people say. The entire city of Colombia was burned solely by General Sherman's Union soldiers in February 1865. Mary Boykin Chestnut's diary is an unbiased account of daily life during the Civil War. These are all things that people may say to you on your tour. All right? Have I talked enough about the South struggle in the Civil War, heroic and just? Do I need to go over that? Okay. Answers to some of these myths are in your manual as well. Do I need to talk about slavery was not the major cause of the Civil War? Got it. Okay. Do I need to talk about the entire city of Columbia was burned solely by General Sherman's Union? Don't need to talk about that one? All right. Just as a reminder to that one, both sides had responsibility. And it was only 1/3. Okay? Not the entire thing. Everybody was responsible.
I remember reading, and I can't remember the name of the book. Was it Wade Hampton III? Wasn't he in charge of the defense of Columbia when Sherman's troops came over? And wasn't he one who told them not to burn the bales of cotton that were in the streets, but that they possibly did anyway? I mean, I just remember that whole narrative, his role in...
There was a great deal of alcohol.
The order was issued, the issue was rescinded. Not everyone necessarily got the order. You have front people, you have a lot of cotton, you have a lot of wind. You have some people who are going to take advantage of the situation on both sides.
Do I need to talk about her diary being an unbiased account?
I always say, no one knows who struck the first match.
That is true. Or kept it going, right? In terms of her diary, just to say, right, not only is it biased, as everything is biased, right? We talk about, there's a trend right now that museums are not neutral, is the trend, right? Not neutral because people are not neutral. You can't be objective as a human being. You always have biases, whether you recognize them or not, right? Her diary is made from an individual person. There's no way that she is unbiased, especially as she is part of the Southern elite, right? So not only can she just technically not be unbiased, but also she was writing this for a purpose, right? She was editing, she was taking things out, she was adding things in. We know this to be fact, right? So for this, it's not like she was like, oh, I wrote this journal, here, somebody publish it, right? It was meant for a very specific purpose, and that goes to that lost cause mythology, right? So again, a reason that it's really important right here for all of you to be talking about this. Let me take a look. Okay, tips for pivoting the conversation, because you're going to have sometimes when you're like, I can't handle this. I can't handle whoever's yelling at me at the moment, all right? So pivoting, adapting, and being uncomfortable. The first tip, it's okay to be a little uncomfortable. That's when learning happens. Okay? I would hope that as you all are giving tours, you're thinking about what you're learning from others just as much as what they are learning from you. So if someone pushes you a little bit and you're a little bit uncomfortable, that's okay. Right? If you're making somebody else a little bit uncomfortable, that's okay as well. When people are not uncomfortable at all, they're just coasting through, they're not really thinking about anything, they're not really learning, right? If you make someone so uncomfortable that they shut down, then they are also not learning anything. So as interpreters, as docents, as educators, it's finding that line of making people a little bit uncomfortable so that they can learn something without making them so uncomfortable that they just shut down. And that takes practice.
And it occurs to me, okay, the choice of, it just came to me when you were talking about, you know, it's okay now to say slave owners, not okay to say masters, and cutting edges enslavers. Just from the tours I've given around here, and the typical group to which you give the tour, enslavers with a lot of those is going to be inflammatory.
Which is why I said I don't know what the staff wants to do. Right?
To me, and the word enslaver is like slave.
Yeah.
It's not a person who enslaves others, it is an enslaver.
Right.
Just as bad a word.
I think there aren't a lot of good options when it comes to that. Right?
Slave owners kind of neutral, it's descriptive.
All right, let me get through these. There's a difference between debating and disrupting. There's a difference between debating and disrupting. Some people will come to you and they want to debate. They want to argue back and forth with you to prove that they are right. And sometimes we fall into that trap because we want to argue back and forth and prove that we are right. Right? So there's a difference between debating and disrupting. When I think about disrupting, I don't use it from a negative space. I'm like, disrupting to me is just pausing people where they are, right? Pausing people, making them think about something. They could end up continuing down the road that they're on and the beliefs that they have. They could make a change and think something different after I've talked to them. But my point is really just trying to get them to pause and think about things. If I'm trying to get them to pause and they're trying to debate with me, we're just going to move on. Right? I'm not going to spend half of my 75 minutes debating whether or not the Civil War was about slavery. Right? I'm not going to do it because I'm trying to get you to think about a bunch of different things. If you're not there, what are we doing? Right? So there's a difference between debating and disrupting. You don't want to debate with people. Right? You want to disrupt their current way of thinking. Remember that you have institutional support for these non-negotiables, right? So if people are coming up with all those quotes and they're saying, why are you using enslaved people? Why are you talking about slavery being the cause of the Civil War? How dare you talk about lost cause mythology? If it gets to a point where you're like, I don't know what to say, I can't do this, remember that you have institutional support. That's what your staff members are there for. Historic Colombia made this commitment to be talking about these aspects, right? You have that in your back pocket. I'm sorry, this is what Historic Colombia is committed to talking about. And these are the things that Historic Colombia is saying, right? Yeah.
It seems to me, and I might be proven wrong, but I don't anticipate as much pushback as maybe the presentation is suggesting to me, because there are elements of the newer presentation that we already include. And I personally have found in the 2 years that people come from all walks of life, all over the United States, to come and learn. They don't come in knowing much about the Hampton-Preston House and Welcome House. They are there to learn. And so they don't come in with animosity, they come in with an open mind to learn what we have to share.
Right, which is great, wonderful.
That's-
My job is to talk about the worst case scenario,
Okay.
right? So yeah, don't be like, oh no, everybody who comes is gonna be this way. They're not gonna be that way. And I talk a lot about like visitors in terms of 1 through 5s, right? The 1s and the 5s don't want to hear what you have to say. They came already thinking that they know what you're gonna say. They already know what they expect. 1s and 5s, you're not gonna change anything in terms of what they're thinking. It's those 2s through 4s, the majority, who are like, oh yeah, I never thought about that aspect. Let me consider more about that. So yeah, the 2s through 4s are going to be where you really are and where you want to focus your attention. I'm focusing on the 1s and 5s right now, right? Those who are at either end of the spectrum, just so if they do ask these questions of you or they do try to debate with you, that you have words and phrases and things to say back to them. So that's a good point. Let me get through just these last two, and then we'll be about finished. So I'm thinking about what I call pocket phrases, so you have them when you need them. Every once in a while, somebody will say something to me that is so crazy that I'm speechless, right? I'm like, I can't even talk to you right now. And when that happens, I have pocket phrases, right? Things in my mental pocket that I can just take out that gives me a little bit of time to calm myself down, right? So if somebody says something, what's something crazy that somebody might say?
I've had a person tell me that that all people are slaves, because you're slave to your bosses, you're slave, you know. So what's the difference between us slave wages and those slaves?
Yes, somebody says that, and I don't know what to say to them. So one of my pocket phrases is, that's really interesting. How did that come about? Right? Or, wow, tell me more about that. Or, oh, really, when did you first learn that?
Or that's why I just do a discussion with them about that?
No, you don't have to get into a discussion with everybody. You can. Right. It does give them a chance to come back to you, but what it also does is that disruption. It makes them think, right? So if I say, what was the first, like, where did you learn that from? And then they have to think about it, and then they're like, oh, I heard it from my racist grandpa. Right? They have to think about where they heard that from, and that gives you a little bit of space. So think about some of those pocket phrases that you have that when you're really stuck, you can just pause for a second, right? The other way to do that is if there are other people in your group, you can bring them into the conversation. So it's not just debate between you and this one person, right? They say something crazy, and you can say, hey everybody, do you all agree with that?
No.
Chances are somebody's going to say that they don't agree with it, right? And then it's not just you and that person. You get everybody else involved in the conversation as well.
But do you really want to do that?
Yeah, do you really want to do that? You only have an hour and 15 minutes. If somebody says something like that and you don't pull out a pocket phrase, right? You can either say something to the effect of, you're crazy and we're not discussing that right now. Or you can say,
I'm going to have to look that up.
Right, I'm going to have to look that up.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to look right on. If you say one or the other, you have a chance of turning them off, which you could think is fine or not. But you also aren't acknowledging them, right? So a lot of times when people are saying things, whatever they're saying, it's because they want to be heard. And so if you acknowledge them, I hear you, then you can move on. If you don't acknowledge them, even in a short amount of time, they're going to keep going for the rest of your tour.
Well, what if you say something like, that's really interesting, I'd like to talk to you about that afterwards?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay.
That's amazing. So she said, hey, that's really interesting. I'll talk to you about that afterwards.
that? Is that rude or is that okay?
No, what do you guys
know
think?
everything.
I haven't heard that before. I actually don't know that. I'm gonna have to look it up. Right?
And then don't forget.
Yeah, send it to Betsy. You know what? Betsy is really interested in that kind of All right. Last thing, you can do this. And reminders about why you should. Okay, you can do this and reminders about why you should. Remember, Hampton-Preston is a unique site. You guys are talking about urban slavery. Not very many people are talking about that. You guys have someone who is significantly a part of the Confederacy, right, and the secession. You all need to be talking about that. We talked about this being a complete history, right? It's not a zero-sum game. Just because you're talking more about the enslaved people who are on the site does not significantly take away from the Hampton-Preston family, okay? So here's what it says, I think, in a couple of different places, but especially at the end, in the conclusion of your manual. Historic Colombia has evolved. Since 1971, this historic site has evolved to tell a more comprehensive story that embraces the stories of all people who worked and lived here for more than 150 years. Okay? I came here 15 years ago. Great. What we talked about 15 years ago, it's not what we're talking about now because the history has evolved. We found more research. We know more things. Historic Colombia's values have evolved, right? Historic Colombia is committed to telling a comprehensive history of the site that includes all individuals who lived and worked here, whether by choice or by force, since the house was constructed in 1818. So you guys saw that at the beginning. It also says in your manual, local, regional, and national events are represented in this site's story, showing how power dynamics of race, class, and gender have changed over time. All right, and then this is just my add-on at the end. By adding these stories in, we are not taking anything away from the story of the house. Rather, we are telling a fuller, more complete story. We are doing the site justice. All right? So those are the reasons that you should be telling these stories. And hopefully, based on some of these, like, what happens if you feel confident that you can tell these stories? Good?
Yep.
All right.
Got it.
Yes.